Good afternoon. This is the first of 3 short slideshow presentations I'm making to outline some key issues related to the $3.3 million line item related to Quarry Park synthetic fields in this year's 2015 budget. First, I wanted to begin with a brief overview of the budget process. Each year in September, the Township Manager presents a draft budget for the upcoming year. This is then reviewed by commissioners and then further discussed and presented over the course of 3 public workshops. On September 29th, we held our first. At the next meeting on October 15th, we'll hear groups regarding community grants. This includes our commissions and councils such as Parks and Recreation, Public Safety, and the Environmental Advisory Council. Additionally, associated groups like LMYA, the library, and our senior organization will present. All these groups traditionally get grant funding. The final meeting on October 29th will be devoted entirely to the Quarry Park proposal. Again, I felt it was important to create these brief slideshows to answer some common questions I've received. I have not been shy about my serious reservations about this $3.3 million line item. This first presentation will deal with the one-time monies that have allowed us to consider the quarry proposal. Before we consider spending such a large chunk of money, I think it is critical that we understand fully where it came from. The second presentation will outline the quarry proposal and my final alternative proposal, which I've begun in the outline of my blog during the final presentation. So here we go. The most critical question I've gotten from residents is how can a township justify spending $3.3 million on a synthetic field when last year the township increased property taxes to fund capital expenses? The answer is basically this year's budget includes 3 types of one-time windfall money. The purpose of this first presentation is to outline these 3 items. First is the real estate transfer tax. Basically, this tax is 1% of every real estate transaction in the township. Of that, the township receives 1/2 of 1%. This year, we have some major transactions, including the first 2 of 7 tracts associated with the Jandal warehouses. This, of course, is the result of the township rezoning 700 acres of farmland from ag protected to industrial, strip commercial, and urban residential. This was the unfortunate rezoning of agriculturally protected lands which were protected for 23 years. This was done by the 2007 board. The first 2 transactions this year netted $130,000 for the township. A likely third will add another $60,000 to $70,000 for a total of around $200,000. This would represent 3 of 7 warehouses that can be built as a result of the zoning change. All in all, there is the potential for nearly $500,000 to be collected. During my time prior to being a commissioner as a resident and then as a candidate, I fought to protect this farmland, and I am saddened by its loss. However, the fact that we'll be collecting this nearly $500,000 in real estate transfer money is perhaps one of the only silver linings of a otherwise sad and tragic situation. I have some strong feelings about this money and how it should be spent, and I will outline them in part 3. Next, we have one-time money associated with Hamilton Crossing's rec fee. Basically, from 2010 to 2013, the township supported negotiated support for certain variance requests that resulted in increased density and intensity in exchange for assurances of quality, infrastructure improvements, and a recreation contribution. Originally, this contribution was to be in the form of the developer physically building ball fields on a track adjacent to the shopping center. Unfortunately, at some point, that deal went away and was replaced with a monetary contribution. Now that Hamilton Crossings have been approved, we are anticipating the nearly $600,000 monetary contribution next year. This has been worked into the 2015 budget and is definitely part of the pie that is being used by commissioners to justify spending money $2.7 million to $3.3 million on Quarry Park. Finally, we have the largest piece of the pie and unfortunately the most misunderstood and confusing. Basically, this deals with a one-time budget transfer. So again, this is a one-time windfall. For a long time, the township had a separate solid waste fund, much like it still maintains with the sewer fund. This is the account where money came in from quarterly solid waste and refuse bills. In 2013, the township made the decision to close down the solid waste fund, and from that point forward, all refuse fees went directly into the general fund. It was the intent of the board at the time that the solid waste fund surplus would act as a savings account from which we could transfer monies from the solid waste fund into the general fund incrementally over the course of 5 to 7 years. However, in March of this year, the township auditors determined that the solid waste fund should be eliminated altogether, and all proceeds should go directly into the general fund balance. So this opens the door for a couple questions. Clearly, I believe where money came from is critically important to understand. Yes, some of this money is developer money, but the vast majority of these funds comes from the solid waste surplus transfer. A question I've received is, shouldn't that money be used to reduce residents' waste bills since the surplus was generated from solid waste refuse bills? And that's a very valid question. If not, then, what is the logic to spend this money on park improvements? These are both very valid questions. An argument can be made that the solid waste expenditures have been made, so therefore this money, in other words, this surplus, is now owed to the general fund. For example, we've spent money recently on capital purchases for the mulching program. So in some ways, the notion that money from the surplus is now owed to the general fund might have merit. Personally, I prefer the money staying in a silo and disagree that it should have ever been blended in the general fund in the first place. But that decision was made by a prior board. I like the idea of money coming in from refuse bills, going into a solid waste silo, and it's being spent from that silo on expenditures that we need to make sure the trash gets collected, the leaves get collected, and the mulching facility continues on. But those are decisions that were made prior to me being on board. And understand, the only reason this money must now be transferred out of the account is essentially we're not bringing money into the account anymore. So the auditor suggested not to use this as a quote-unquote savings account, but rather suggested that we need to transfer this money now. That is the largest part of the windfall. So this is in essence money that was collected as part of refuse bills, not developer money. In my opinion, this is a kind of fuzzy shell game that opens the door to stealth taxes. Certainly, it's the kind of thinking that leads to a township raising taxes one year, but then spending millions, or rather proposing spending millions of dollars on turf the very next. This leads me to some final thoughts, dealing with one-time revenue in this budget cycle. First, I have no problem supporting the spending of every single cent of the Hamilton Crossings recreation fee money on Quarry Park. And I'm going to outline how I think that should be done in part 3 of this presentation that goes over my alternative proposal. I do, however, question the spending of the Jandal real estate transfer money and also the solid waste, or actually at least the bulk of the solid waste transfer money on this one park. And again, in the next part of this presentation, I'm going to go over the Quarry Park proposal, and then finally, in the third part, I'm going to outline my alternate proposal.